Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so this um, presentation's focus on how our focus on ministry serving the poor and addicted impacts course, program, and organizational design. So with our three values, Jesus, justice, and technology, this one's really focused on the Jesus justice. So another way of putting this is how does Jesus justice inform our pedagogy or andragogy? Um, the third value, technology, is largely a means to affordability and accessibility, and it's not really a pedagogical priority except for designing based on what's good online education and online education. There's certain things that online education is really effective at, cognitive learning, and then there's things that it's bad at, for example, transformational learning. So how does Jesus justice inform our pedagogy? So we have these values. So the technology value, and then we have the sub values. So that's kind of the focus of this talk. Does that make sense? Okay, so the best way to kind of understand what we're trying to do is to look at another model. So I don't know if you guys have heard of the term Afrocentric education, but the idea is, in really in most contexts, it's African American centric education. But the whole reason why there's historically black universities was because white universities, I mean, first of all, you had segregation, but secondly, African American people went into a curriculum that was designed largely for the majority of the students that were not black, right? So the idea behind a Afrocentric learning model, and what I love about this is it's not just if you look at these different things. So it's what items are important that show up here, like self-identity, core identity, social identity, black identity. Identity is very important there, right? So key goals of Afrocentric education. So an Afrocentric focus on what's important. So what is the curriculum? What are you going to cover in the curriculum? If you're going to cover history, what aspects of history you cover, is an example. Developing a positive identity and a dominant culture that may devalue Black identity, whether intentionally or unintentionally. Creating positive meta narratives in history from Black perspective. So whenever I read Black history, I mean, that's the whole purpose of Black history and Black History Month, from my perspective, is creating a positive meta narrative um, to be centered around the strengths of Black culture, to create a path for acculturation into society without assimilation, so becoming fluent in the dominant forms. Development of Afrocentric leaders with strong Black identity. This is Du Bois's, he talks about the talented 10th, um, and acculturation to what I would call dominant class Black norms. So rich and upper middle class Black norms without assimilation to white norms. So you can class, in my terminology, I would say you can class assimilate while staying Black. Um, but and then so that is the goals to the students, but there's also group outcomes. So health of the Black community, building healthy Black organizations, institutions, long-term development of Black culture, avoid tendencies towards group assimilation. So why am I kind of, explaining this? Um, is because Afrocentric education provides good model to learn from for Christ-centric and class-centric education. And those are really what the Jesus and justice aspects of our um, values are. So for this Christ-centric, so Christ-centered focus on what's important in the curriculum, developing a positive identity and a dominant culture that may devalue Christian identity, positive meta narratives and history from Christian perspectives, centered around the strengths of Christian culture, acculturation without assimilation, and development of Christian leaders with strong Christian identity. So the whole Christian liberal arts movement, this is a key part of that, but those are the individual, but then you have groups. So the health of the Christian community and world, build healthy Christian organizations, institutions, long-term development of Christian culture, avoid the tendency towards assimilation and advance the gospel. Same thing of this, what I would call a working class centric education. So working class centric focus on what's important in the curriculum, develop a positive identity and a dominant culture that may devalue those from working class and poor backgrounds. I should have an and in there. Positive meta narratives and personal history from backgrounds, so working class, poverty, and or addiction, creating positive meta narratives given that background, centered around strengths of working class culture, acculturation to working class or professional class without assimilation. And in the term in the Black community, that's called code switching. So can you code switch? Development of leaders. So basically, do you have to assimilate who you used to be, or can you still retain the positive aspects of that? Development of leaders, serving the poor and the addicted, strongly identifying with the poor and the addicted. Um, and then the group outcomes, health of the last, the least, and the lost, building organizations to serve the poor and the addicted, long-term development of Christian culture that serves the poor and the addicted is what that should be saying, and avoid a tendency towards class assimilation. Does that make sense to folks? So this is Jesus' justice. So we're trying to be Christ-centered to a large extent, working class-centered. I would say that's an oversimplification of the justice part, but that's one part of it. So in cross-cultural courses, there's this thing called the Berry acculturation model. Is it important to develop relationships with larger society? Yes or no? And is it important to maintain one's identity? You could apply this to social class, Black identity, Christian identity. And then if you say yes, it's important to engage with the larger society, but no to Christian identity, you assimilate. So that's secularized. Most Christian institutions are focused on biblical engagement in the world, but not of the world. This is marginalization, kind of fundamentalists, or actually, no, that's not fundamentalists. So this is cultural evangelicals who do not attend church. That's actually the biggest growing group of evangelicals, which to me is kind of an oxymoron. Um, and then you have separation, so fundamentalism. Um, so there's different models towards those things. So, we're trying to promote this, right? Um, Now, the other thing to understand is there's three different frameworks for non-dominant culture ministries in Christian education. So there's race focused, and that's pretty common. So most urban ministry education, that's Afrocentric education. I would say that's also what Christian Community Development Association's dominant framework is. Then you have class focused. So that's Salvation Army and Rescue Missions. They don't use this terminology, but I'm just putting it in terminology of sociology that I don't know is the way you'd characterize it. Um, and so they're focused on the poor, right? So it's class focus, and City Vision University is pretty far in this space. I mean, we do race, but that's not our major, we minor. And then there's globally focused. So Baca University, 70% of their students are international. They largely serve the Lausanne cities movement. And but there's also a lot of global relief organizations, so World Vision. Most justice-focused Christian colleges, say like Eastern University, they're going to be generally more globally focused, somewhat racially focused, definitely not class focused because they price themselves out of they don't have this group there basically because they can't afford it except for a few scholarship students. Does that make sense? Yeah, folks. Okay. Now, you can do a 2 by 2 grid around higher education institutions, secular versus Christian, non-majority, majority. I've showed you guys this before. So this is kind of the size of the market. So you got traditional government-run institutions, state schools, traditional Christian colleges, and then non-majority culture. You got this is Afrocentric education, Hispanic-centric, minority serving institutions, but then you have class focus. Right now, it's mainly community colleges and trade and vocational schools. Um, this is where the growth is happening. This is disruptive innovation. You got the secular mega universities and the Christian mega universities. And then you have non-majority culture Christian higher education that's accredited in the US. Tiny. This basically doesn't exist because it's a double niche. So if you're going to be a Christian institution and you're going to focus almost exclusively on serving the poor, you're basically not going to have a budget. So what's happening and the reason for that is because you can only create critical mass within a region or maybe a city. What disruptive innovation is opening up is national scope. So we're able to create a critical mass of students so that we can get to scale, and that's what we're trying to do here. Does that make sense? Okay. So another way of looking at this is, a race and class grid. So you got lower, middle, upper, and then you got different groups. What a lot of Christian schools are trying to do is they're trying to create a span here. So this is CCCU is they're trying to be multiracial, but if you said what's the average, their average is probably in the upper middle class, right? And then community colleges, their average is kind of somewhere in, the lower middle and working class. Um, so, City Vision, our students, that what the gray area is, our students kind of span this. Um, Most people who could afford to attend a CCCU school aren't going to go to City Vision. And if they came here, they would be mad because they're used to high-end schools and they're not going to like it here. Because, well, for a variety of reasons. I'm not going to go negative on that, but for a variety of reasons. So anyway, are you guys tracking with me so far on this?
Yes.
Okay. So in our core values, so if you go to our values page, and this was a slight tweak that I made to our values recently as I was designing courses, I realized there are aspects of our values that don't show up that are guiding how we do things. And I added the word, so I used to say focused on serving the poor and the addicted, and I added the word organizations because um it's not just serving the poor and the addicted. It is particularly on organizations serving the poor and the addicted. So that's huge, and I'm going to talk a lot about that. So it's not just the poor and the addicted, it's the fact that we're working with these organizations. And then the practical education. And then the third one's radically affordable, but radically affordable largely relates to the technology sub-values that kind of point back up to that. This is more the outcome of those. So all right. So with that, going to the organization thing is we're designing courses. So what's the point of all this? Is I'm trying to get what's in my head to help you guys be able to better design courses and better design, systems. Some of you may not be designing courses right now, but Andrew, in the future, we may have you provide input into course design. And TJ, same type of thing. For Brian, this is immediately replicable. Evan, in your case, I feel like you've lived this, your 17 years here, but making it explicit and explaining how some of the dots connect can be helpful. So, um, you know, one tier is serving clients. So, and we do that two ways. One is directly through Wounded Healers program, but the second is can we make the staff more effective at serving clients? So improving their ability to transform lives, especially the poor and the addicted. Then we have the students. So enabling our students to build their professional capacity, advancing their career. But if you look at our mission, it's about transforming lives, right? So we're really concerned about this, not just our students. And then enabling our partners to build their capacity to improve their ability to transform lives, and then to serve as a major source for thought leaders and innovation to enable the movements to grow and thrive. So as I'm writing courses, I'm thinking about all of these audiences. Does that make sense? And that's making them very different than how other schools would design courses. So 80% of our students come from rescue mission like organizations. So I ask questions each week and for each assignment. How does this assignment relate to their context? How can it help bring life change to clients, improve the student's professional capacity, increase the organization's capacity, and grow the movement? Um, so most courses, and this is very different in our counseling courses, most courses, as I'm designing them, will have at least one student project focused on building the capacity of the organization. Other schools aren't going to have that in their counseling courses. So designing a manual, connect theory to your organization's programs. Um, there's a huge difference between clinical counseling and residential recovery programs. So most counseling programs are at least 90% focused on clinical counseling and case management. Um, but honestly, for a lot of our partners, clinical counseling and case management make up less than 5% of the time most clients spend in their programs. Andrew, at St. Matthew's, I mean, students are there 24/7, right? What do they get? Like 1 or 2 hours a week of counseling and case management, at least one to one.
One-to-one is usually one case management session every other week, so maybe an
Yeah,
hour a week. But it's
right.
yeah, yeah,
And you probably have groups, so it's going to be higher than that with group models,
yeah.
right? But
hmm
um,
It's about six to
but
eight hours a week. Yeah.
Yeah. So the model of change is radically different. So change happens through Christian discipleship, not through clinical counseling, right? So my view, just off the top of my head, 50% of that is healthy community. You know,
Hmm.
the Christian paradigm is it starts with God and then it goes to community. Like that's where the influence happens. Like you can't do Christianity without a community. And then I would say 40% is training, programming, doing, 10% counseling, case management. So what does that mean? In this course, Brian, that you and I are working on, I developed something borrowing from the multicultural counseling competency cube, and I wanted to kind of explain three dimensions. So you have um, intervention dimensions. So this is essentially, in your program design. So you have the clinician, and that's the personal maturity and lived experience of the counselor or staff. And then you have what you're doing in clinical counseling and case management. Then you have the program elements if you're having a residential program. And so that's the stuff they do. But, the bigger impact is the community. If you have a healthy, vibrant community that's positive, that's going to make a bigger difference. Most Christian counseling integration courses in that first textbook, Brian, that we're going with, this is basically the main thing that it focuses on, that one that's focused on theory. And that was my frustration. I was like, this is such a small part of what's important. And let me cover these other dimensions also. So then I was like, let's get another textbook. Um, and so we got a second textbook that was focused on skills, and that was helpful. But then I was like, even that still is focused almost exclusively on clinical counseling. So then I decided I needed to add a third textbook to focus on program and community. And then so you have these other things. So you have Christian integration knowledge, Christian clinical counseling skills. So like, how do you actually translate this into skills and techniques? Like, how would you pray for someone in a clinical session, right? Um, but you might also integrate that into your program, have regular prayer time, and your theory can inform this and it can inform your program design. And then you have, so here are other competencies, expertise in Christian program design, expertise in building healthy Christian community. And then you have different dimensions for client development. So emotional stability, Christian teaching, support community, life skills, program development, physical health. So if you take our mission as maximizing life change, right? What should Christian integration be? Well, this part here is kind of beyond the scope of this Christian integration course. Like, we're not going to focus that course on trying to mature the counselor, because that's just trying to do too much. But we do a lot of that in our courses that honestly a lot of schools don't do, um, where we do a lot more personal reflection, I would say. But, adding these other elements in. So the final project in that course is actually trying to integrate all these towards the organization and having them look at all the components of the organization's program design, integrating all those together. Does that make sense to folks? And that's part of why, Brian, once we got into that course, and then, I just realized you don't have this framework. You don't know the level of detail of what, you know, I'm trying to get, partners that will provide hundreds of pages that will kind of fill out what makes this effective. And even that third book that I added in, it really is focused on this quadrant. So, but what we're trying to do is maximize life change. If most of the life change is happening in these components, we have to kind of figure out how do we do that. So, okay, so that's one domain, practical education. So how do you design a course that will teach students exactly what they need to know for their work? Um, and these are questions as I'm doing a course design, I'm thinking about this. So, one answer to that is relating assignments to their work context. There's more to that. But this is one of the quotes that we hear from students sometimes, and that's exactly what we want to hear. So I think I heard that from you, Andrew, whenever you went through a lot of your courses that so, what would a version of this course look like that is radically focused on practical application? So taking this Christian integration, a lot of our addiction counseling, we increase the focus on technique. We recognize the importance of community and program. We help students consider practical questions related to the material that the organizations are facing. Does that make sense? Um, then what are the primary practical goals that students and organizations would use this course for? So recenter the organization around that using backward design. So in this case, Brian, what I did is I made the major project. How do you design a program informed by good theory on Christian integration and technique? Another example is organizational behavior. If you take a typical organizational behavior, it's kind of like you ever do the greatest hits album of, some sort of band. It's like their best songs, out of the, 30 years that they've had songs. Organizational behavior is like the same thing. It's basically like if you take an organizational textbook, it's basically out of the past, 50 years of that field, what are the top 20 greatest hits? And all you do is you just go over those theory, but zero application for the most part. Um, but what's the application? What do students and organizations want to do is they want to take these theories to build a healthy organization. So we rewrote that course with that end in mind. Um, so what are the most used simple practical tools out of this field that fit our students? I did a doctoral course on organizational culture, and there's a guy, Shine, is kind of like the guru of organizational culture. He's written like 50 books. Anyone who references that space, but all of his books, like I read through his doctoral book, it had like 100 different theories on organizations. No application or very little application. Competing values framework is the most helpful practical theory. So in teaching this, we've emphasized, probably 40% of the emphasis of org behavior and organizational culture is we're focusing on this because it's this simple tool that can be practically applied. Whereas a lot of his theories, honestly, you're like, what do you do with this? He would answer, I don't know. It's just interesting theory, right? That we've discovered about how organizations, right? Another one, and I'm doing this in family counseling, Bowen theory is used extensively in ministries and churches, and it fits relational dynamics of churches really well. And it also fits kind of Christian understanding of, I don't know, layers of culture, and you have extended families and things like that. It can be helpful. So in the family course, we're going deep on Bowen theory. It's just one of the theories in, that week on family systems, but Bowen theory has a lot of practical applications, as an example. I ask questions like, is there a way to design a multi-step final or major project for this course? So can you create an organizational manual or a personal reflection application journal? And then often I will select at least one book based on the ability to translate it into kind of a practical context. So for our reaccreditation review, we had one reviewer who was honestly ignorant and thought that all textbooks had to be published in the past 5 years. And they didn't like the fact that for our business inter, introduction to business plans or introduction to entrepreneurship course, we were using an 8-year-old book. But the reason why we chose that book is because, first of all, the field doesn't change. Secondly, that book was built as a how-to manual, and it was easy to create a constructionist course around that book. So often I'm looking for a book that will lend itself towards essentially a final project. Does that make sense? So in the counseling space, often it's, how do you translate this into technique? How do you translate this into program design, staff training manuals? Does that make sense? Um, all right. Okay, so course design for non-dominant class culture. Um, I have read probably about 50 books on social class, and one of the things I teach on is social class as culture. And there's different cultural dimensions that, different groups will have preferences for. So one of the tensions is the project management triangle, where the idea behind this is you can pick two out of three. but you can't have all three. So if you want something that is fast and high quality, it's going to cost a whole lot. So for us, our priority is number one, cost, number two, quality, and number three is going to be speed. So because that's the preference of non-dominant class. You could call this working class and you could call this upper middle class, but in a lot of my teaching, I use dominant class and non-dominant class. So if you're poor, it doesn't really matter if you can't afford it. You know what I'm saying? So that's why cost is the first for us. So good enough iterative design. That's why we do it the way we do it. Um, we put a stronger emphasis on self-reflection and personal growth, so more relational. And that also relates to that other diagram that, in a lot of these Christian, counseling, they don't look at the number one factor I know in counseling they realize it's the relationship with the counselor, but I have probably had 20 counselors over my life, and the number one factor for me on influence is the character of that person who is the counselor, that's working with me. And the best counselor was someone who is honestly is just the wisest person that I've interacted with. So um, designed for tension with the objective clinical counseling model. So the dominant class value, so versus, how much are you going to focus on objective versus subjective? And these are tensions. Um, and then emphasis on health and burnout. So these are all, classes culture. So trauma is common among if you're poor. Trauma is avoided, honestly, if you're rich. So what's the design implication of that? The design implication of that is an emphasis on health and burnout. Um, Dominant class values towards big organizations, competing values framework, the organization is a business versus the organization is a family or a clan, smaller organizations. There's actually one more that I was going to add and I forgot to add it. So, and you can do cultural dimensions like Holsted's cultural dimensions. I think this is actually one of Holsted's cultural dimensions, where do you start with the practical in the specific case, or do you start with the theory? And each cultural group is going to have a difference. In academia, it's always the theory. That's not where most of our students are coming from. They're not going to pay attention to the theory unless you explain it to them why it's practical. So, like, whenever I design a course, the past two or three courses, I've had to change the chapter order because the chapter order almost always is just like the logical way of outlining the theory. I put some meat up front because otherwise the students are going to quit or they're going to be like, why are you teaching me this useless stuff? You know, so that also informs design. Um, there's in counseling, there's kind of this social class hierarchy. Um, and so, this is what a typical addiction treatment center might have. At the top, you're going to have a psychiatrist or MD. They're making 100, 250,000. That's the top 20% socioeconomically. Then you might have middle class or upper middle class, depending on who you are and where you're living. But LPCs, licensed clinical social workers, they're making 60 to 100,000, 50 to 90, depending on where you live. Um, and then you have, what's the whole purpose of the addiction counseling movement from a cultural perspective? It is a working class centered framework. And that's the whole purpose of that from a cultural perspective. And then you have peer specialists that are kind of in a class that it's unfortunate, but they're basically the working poor. Most peer specialists, if you're working as a peer specialist, you're barely getting by financially. So does this make sense to folks? And recognizing that
Yes.
there is different class implications. So, Andrew, you're probably seeing this as you're going through a clinical social worker, like they're going to be doing a lot more on the theory. They're going to be, and there's different rules that they're following on this.
Yeah.
Um, and, the assumption is, oh, the theory is more important. Well, maybe. I'm not sure. I think that there's a kind of that's an ethnocentric perspective. So another key concept is this, what I call the race, class, and gender trilemma. So the trilemma is like that last thing I showed you of, cost, where was it? cost, speed, and quality is a trilemma. So, race, class, and gender, based on the limitations of social location, cultures, and frameworks, tend to only be effective at one or two elements of race, class, and gender. So, what do I mean by that? So, the addiction counseling field is a class-centric field, and the dominant culture is here. They're really good at handling class elements. Um, I would put most LPC programs as even, this multicultural, they talk about race, they don't live race. You know what I'm saying? So, and honestly, a book about France is not France. So they do a very good book about France, but the field itself is an upper middle class dominant field is basically my view. They cover gender, they live gender a lot better because the majority of counselors are women, so I think they're living it better than they are on race. Um, this book that we're doing on multicultural counseling, this urban ministry, Christian counseling, multicultural framework, that one is race centered. Does that make sense? So as you get, every book is going to have a social location. And usually the social locations, I mean, most books, honestly, are not even on this grid. They're majority culture. So they're not actually taking any of these social locations. So does that make sense? So part of what I'm trying to do is balance out the social location. So in this course, I had to take, so this is our multicultural counseling course. I had to use this because that's a requirement of KCRAP. But then I wanted to get a class perspective, an addiction perspective, and then one that's a little more centered around race. Does that make sense for folks? Okay. Now, this is how I kind of rewrote the um, I rewrote the multiculturalism framework. So within addiction counseling, so this TAP 15 or tip 59, improving cultural competence. They were trying to basically create a cube, and this is where I borrowed from this cube. And what they did, and this was to me, I was like, man, you're trying, but you're not doing it. Was basically my critique was they said we're going to have these different dimensions: cultural awareness, cultural knowledge of behavioral health, and then cultural skills. To me, I was like, no, that does not follow good pedagogy. You got head, heart, and hand. You have cognitive, psychomotor, and you have affective domain. You're leaving out one domain completely, the psychomotor. Um, or I mean, I guess you could say this is psychomotor, but the affective domain isn't there at all. So what they do is that they're basically um, having three knowledge cubes, and then here they have the individual staff level. So to their credit, most LPC models don't even list this. They just start here. And then they recognize the organizational level. So I really liked that aspect. And then this part's obvious, like any multicultural counseling grid you look at, it's going to cover, different groups. I liked how, if you actually look at tip um, 57, they also included things like military status, which is huge in terms of trauma. And honestly, that normally doesn't show up. But they have other things like drug culture, making it that there's other dimensions to culture. So what I did is I kind of rewrote this and I said, you're going to have cultural knowledge, that's the cognitive. So throw those three box into one, your cultural heart, the affective, your cultural skills, and then your cultural identity. So, and let me just use your fluency in Black culture. So I've lived in Black culture about 40 of my 50 years. I've lost a lot of my cultural skills. Like I could do 80s Black culture, but that's what I grew up in. But man, that's like really old school. So I'm not currently have that current level of fluent identity. I'm bicultural. But I'm bicultural as a 51-year-old, right? So um, and my fluency here isn't as good. My knowledge is pretty deep. I probably read 50 plus books kind of in the from an Afrocentric perspective. Um, so that's kind of what I'm talking about. Now, at the clinical level, I haven't been trained in, okay, what are clinical models that are going to be particularly useful? and with the Black community, and the organizational, I'm pretty solid there. Does that make sense? In terms of other dimensions of understanding dimensions of cultural competence. So three of our courses are focused here, and then our addiction counseling course is focused here. Um, all right. So the last part, this relates, and this is more common in counseling. So you start with fact recall and what you know, and then interpretation and application, so knows how, demonstration, and then performance and practice. Now, most counseling programs will get you through this, but the reality is what I feel like is kind of sad is it's kind of like you do most of the focus is on these first two, and then there's no bridge between here, and you're just thrown into internships and practicum, and that's where you have to actually really figure out this stuff. What we're trying to do is create a better bridge there. Um, and I would say with our values, we're trying to focus more on that. So, um, all right. The last thing of how we do courses different relates to justice, and it's how for-profit incentives distort online education. So understanding organization design and understanding business models, there's a simple formula for maximizing the profitability of online education. Maximum profit equals minimal work for faculty. So that means that you can have a, each faculty teaching a lot more students. So you have to, your total cost for faculty's pay. I mean, your total faculty pay cost is less. And then that's also minimal work for students. And then what you do is you invest heavily in brand and the external trappings of compliance. So you'll have like 15 staff that, all they do is help you get reaccredited. But the reality is people aren't learning a whole lot in your courses. And been on accreditation visits, and honestly, this is endemic. The entire field is like this. And to me, it's a justice issue. So the accreditation standards require that the average student complete about 135 hours of a 3 credit course. So most online courses are designed to require 1/3 to 1/2 of that. Typically, they have adequate content, but the assessments can be completed without learning most of the content and gaining mastery of the topic. So you'll have 135 hours worth of content if you read through everything, but you got a 3-page, the only assignment that's due is like a 3-page assignment. And that person is not going to have mastery of this. So the relation to City Vision's values, one is this is an injustice that reduces the education gained by students to the profit of the educational institution. Two, I feel like it's kind of enabling, and students kind of enable this because they're more motivated by getting the credential than learning. And if our mission was to maximize credentials, then we'd probably go along with this. But our mission is to maximize the ability of our students and partner ministries, need to fix the misspelling, to transform lives. So that's kind of the quick summary. Let me just stop there and see if people have questions or thoughts on this. I know this is a lot of information to dump on you. What my hope is, for people like Brian or Evan, part of the challenge of my lectures is they're usually synthesis of like multiple books. Um, so there's a lot of density. So the challenge is in what I realize, and I think this is probably the fundamental problem for my Faculty 201 course. At best, it's only realistic that people are going to retain 5% of this as they go to design courses because it's just hard to retain. So my hope is that as people are designing courses, they revisit some of these lectures and things along those lines. Does that make sense? Especially like if TJ say we have you design a course in 2 years from now, um, you're not going to remember this stuff. You know what I'm saying? So that's part of the intent. And I think that's one of the challenges of, Faculty 201 is that if I really wanted people to retain more, I would build assessments around this in Faculty 201, but we don't have the time and energy to make someone go through 60 hours worth of homework for Faculty 201 before they start designing a course. on either side, on either my side or the faculty side. So essentially, we're throwing them out there and then hoping they retain this. But yeah. Any other thoughts on this? Um, I'm gonna. I had a talk on how to use Notebook LM. I don't think I'm gonna have time to do that. Let me just see how long that talk is because I get 10 minutes. Um, Notebook LM. Yeah, what I'm gonna do is I think I'll try to record that over the weekend and I'll send you guys a copy of this. So Brian and Dina, it'll be most helpful for you. But in general, just about any project I work on now, I'm using Notebook LM throughout it, and I'll show you what I found is helpful. Um, Brian, you should know that the course you and I are designing, one of the books is too big for Notebook LM, and it's giving nonsensical answers on the big book. I asked it to summarize the chapters, and I don't know, I think it must have in its library an older version of the book because it came up with chapter names that were not the correct chapter names, but seemed like it was probably an earlier edition.
Yeah, I noticed
Um,
that. Was that for the integrative book or was that for the
the longer one, yeah, I think it's the integrative one. It was the longer one. So
yeah,
I'm going to see
I
if I
was
can break it
asking for
up into
chapter
two.
6 and it popped up
Yeah,
the title for chapter 3 or something. Yeah,
right. I
there's
mean, it's still kind of buggy also in that I there's been several cases where I'll ask it to look for us, there's a source in there and I'll name the source and it can't find it or, other things like that. So, um, but anyway. Um, Evan, you've been here, you've seen some of our courses. Are there any instances where you've seen where we've connected the dots in course design besides the ones that examples I've used? Or is that too difficult a question to throw at you right now? You're muted right now, Evan.
Sorry, it's because I was coughing. No, it's not difficult at all. I think that a lot of our courses are like this. I mean, in some of the courses that I've worked with the most closely have been Bible or theology, so they're not as applied. But in courses like most recently, I could see like for holistic personal health, obviously a life skills course, or for wounded healers, life skills, and thinking
Right,
about essentially getting people to apply these different counseling theories that exist, whether it's DBT or CBT, um, to themselves and consider how they can make use of them to improve their own personal health and spirituality or sustainability and
right,
avoid burnout so that then if they go on to be someone who is going to be counseling others that they're not basically perpetuating the same kind of woundedness that they themselves may have had that kind of motivates them to help other people. But if they don't deal with those issues, then they're not really going to be able to counsel people effectively.
right. Yeah, yeah. And actually, the personal health one's a really good example. So I liked how, Evan, didn't you say you took a personal health course? Was that
I
you?
mean, in pretty much like 95% of all colleges, you have to take a health and fitness course, but it
Right.
was mainly like a textbook and it was just kind of pro forma checking a box.
Right. Yeah. And that's what we want to avoid here. So and everyone I've talked to, they're like, I learned a few facts about personal health. It had zero impact in changing my life. And that goes against our mission. Like, I would rather not have that course. Don't have it a part of the curriculum. That's wasting people's time. We have a lot of life-changing courses, and if I had a course like that, we might have students take that course instead, and instead of getting their lives changed, they would just learn some facts, which is, not that helpful. So that course is about 10%. The way we design the course is probably about 10% similar to the typical course. So 90% was different. And part of it is what you have to do is, I mean, not to get into all the details, you have to deconstruct the whole idea behind academia of how they think change happens and kind of what is the purpose of academia. I mean, all of academia grew up in a modernist model. In a modernist model, it's all about knowledge. And, the cognitive domain rules. And, one of the Christian critiques of that was that, pedagogically, and, they translated, and instead of the word became flesh, they said the word became text. Um, and Jesus transforms us because he became flesh. And he didn't transform us because he became red letters on a Bible. That part's huge, huge, super important. But you know, guy could have just sent a big email to us, right? And said, "Hey, print it." And that wasn't the way God, he realized that's not how change happens, right? So there's just a whole lot of things that's messed up about how the whole academic system works. And you have to be able to deconstruct it and then reconstruct it according to our audience. So that's essentially what I'm trying to do with these pedagogical rules. And it's the same type of thing with the practical of just like the first 4 years of my college, I was going through and I kept thinking next year they're going to teach me something useful. And I thought, oh, that's what grad school is going to be for. Grad school, they'll teach me something useful. And then I just realized, no, I had a working class centric understanding of what education's about. And they had a, you know, ivory tower understanding of it's about the greatest hits. What are the greatest hits of organizational theory? It's let's study these hits and let's worship these hits. And they are amazing theories and let's worship the theories. Like, no. What is the purpose of these theories? How do we apply them into our context? How do we change lives? So that's what it means to be mission centric. Does that make sense? I mean, the theories are important. Don't get me wrong, but the theories by themselves are useless. So does that make sense? Okay.
I think if I may say something else kind of related to that, the way I see it is thinking of if you read Covey's Seven Habits of Highly Effective People, what does it mean to begin with the end in mind for our
Right.
courses? So Andrew's kind of delineated, what our end is. It's about transforming individuals' lives and also helping equip them so they can more effectively lead their organizations and lead their movements to better serve the poor, the addicted, and the homeless. And so, if that's the end that we have as a school, then we think, okay, well, this is the broad topic that we have for this course, but how are we going to redesign the way in which we teach that based on what they're going to be able to do with it afterwards, not
Right.
just providing them information?
Yeah.
And if I may, just a couple of things from my personal experience recently starting teaching here, and then same like with Walden. So like I learned a whole bunch of new theories, but because of my education C division, I'm learning with the end in mind. So I know
Mhm.
where the theory is going to end and where it's going to result, right?
Mhm.
Because so it's who do I apply it to? So that's where the
Right.
cultural thing that Dr. Sears is going to come to. So, if you take the feminist out of the feminist theory, it's just strengths, right?
Right.
When you take
Yeah.
the race or the gender out of it, so a lot of the theories are just kind of duplicated. But
Right.
in the classes, in the way that you've designed them or we've designed them without the me, is like I recognize in wounded healers when I see someone's work that the assignments are leading them towards the next week's work,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
So if I can either spoil it and tell them something, or I can hold back and then just increase the foundation of
Right.
what they're learning because the next week's going to handle me spoiling it. So
Yeah.
the being able to be competent enough as a teacher to do that with the way that we've designed the courses is it's a blessing is what it is. It's
Right. Yeah.
so
So Brian, why I'm wanting you and Dina to visit rescue missions is you take our mission, it's about transforming lives, Jesus, justice, technology, kind of through recognizing those values. Um, and you have to understand the context. So, you know, in the tour that you're doing of St. Matthew's, half the tour and half the things is you're going to be learning about how St. Matthew's program works. The other half is Andrew himself. So there's a reason why I want Andrew to be the one because Andrew, I want you to explain how the stuff you learned helped you get better at transforming lives and how it helped transform your own lives. Does that make sense? Because if he understands those connections so what we're trying to do is we're trying to get our partners to be able to up their game. And how are these courses helping at each of those levels? The client, the student, the organization, and the movement. So that's kind of the summary. All right. We need to end this meeting because we got another team meeting. I'll try to record, if I can, the Notebook LM for you guys. I had two other things that I would have liked to have covered. But I'm going to be adding these things to, gradually what I'm doing is, faculty 201 still probably only has about 20% of what it needs to have in it. So I'm gradually going to be adding, through these sessions. So it's going to be a lot more lecture focus initially, and then eventually we'll, get a lot more dialogue. So does that make sense? So Brian, if you have questions related to this, write down notes, both from your visit to St. Matthew's and this and the other talk. Hopefully all these things will integrate together well. So, okay.
Mm.
All right. See ya.
Bye.
Okay.
Andrew, I think that you're still on the partner team meeting. So, all right. See you, Brian.
Oh, is that what's coming next? Okay. Whew.
Yeah.
All
All
right.
right.
I'm gonna use the
You
restroom
can
here.
take a break. Yeah,
All
I
right.
am too.
All right. I'll be right there. Yeah.